Last week we had a few words to say about the mercy of David, and as you come to know me, you'll find out the hardest thing for me to do is say a few words about David. I find him to be such an interesting character, and you get more David this week, in fact. But this week, I'll just confess up front, is not nearly as pleasant a lesson. Given the choice, I could preach 52 weeks a year about mercy. It's much harder to preach about this section of the life of David and the tragedy that unfolds. It's significant to the Bible in a great many ways, both in how the Bible itself is structured, but again, a few words, which means I can't go that direction. It's significant to how the dynasty of Israel plays out. Again, a few words, can't go that direction. Today, I just want to talk about the story of David and his greatest tragedy as it relates to our understanding of sin. It's a very personal story, and you're supposed to be bothered by it. And so let's take a look. The text comes from 2 Samuel chapter 11 and 12, primarily chapter 11. And the story we know as the story of David and Bathsheba, probably better titled the story of David and Uriah, the way the story is told, but for our purposes, that'll do. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained at Jerusalem. That little line at the end is the first hint in this chapter that something isn't quite right. And we don't even know exactly what it is. This is one of those stories where I would like some backstory that I'm not given. David makes a name for himself as a warrior. He becomes king because he is a warrior. Saul envies him because he is a warrior of renown. The people chant, Saul has killed his thousands, but David his 10,000s, right? He's a well-known warrior, and battling the Philistines is his claim to fame. But for whatever reason, on this occasion, he is staying home in Jerusalem and not on the field. His honor is up for grabs, whereas his men of war, his warriors, are out collecting honor for themselves and becoming well known. David himself is not. And so there's an issue at play of what does this tell us about David and how is David feeling about himself? Are you a person who likes to be active, to be a doer? How do you feel when you can't? I'm married to a doer. My wife is an active person. And nothing about chemo has been more frustrating to her than not getting to do. I've told her several times, mostly joking, that if the roles were reversed, we'd be fine. I'm good at sitting in a recliner. She's good at doing all the work. There'd be no problem. And for her, though, this is just, agonizing to not be able to do things. As evidenced by a few recent episodes where she tried to do things and shouldn't. Funny story there, but really I do have to not tell that. Point is, you can ask her about it. Point is, it's hard when you're a doer to not be doing. David is a warrior not going to war. And his honor is at stake. His masculinity is at stake. And that seems to play into the tragic story that follows. I'm going to summarize it quickly, as quick as I can, because it's so hard. I want to say so much. And then we'll make some observations at the end. The story begins with what can only generously be called a one-night stand. There was a movie I don't know when it was produced. I'd have to go back and look. It was before my time. It had Gregory Peck in it, if that tells you anything. It goes back a ways. But it was a Hollywood adaptation of the David and Bathsheba story. And if you watch the trailer for it, it says, a romance so great it defied their law of God. Wow, that sounds romantic. No part of that is true. This is in no sense a romance. This is at best a one-night stand, and if you'll stay with me a little bit, I'm going to tell you it's much worse than that. David sees a woman bathing on the roof while he's cooped up at home, and he sends his messengers over, and they take her and bring her to him, and he lays with her. The language itself is just cold. Nothing good about the language. He sees her, he sends a messenger over, he takes her, is the way that it's worded. The fallout of that is that afterwards she becomes pregnant. The woman, Bathsheba, is another man's wife, not David's, and that other man is out doing what David is not. He is an honorable man out on the field of battle with his troops in solidarity with them, and David is at home, and now she's pregnant. So David, clever fellow, comes up with a scheme to cover it up. He calls Uriah home from the wars and says, "Come on home and relax a bit and stay with your wife." And he figures if he can get the timing just about right, then men will do what men do and women will do what women do, and no one needs to be the wiser, is his plan. But Uriah is quite the fellow. He, in an act of considerable solidarity with his troops out in the field, says, "I don't rest until they do," and refuses to go home to his wife, but rather takes a nap on the front porch, as the text describes. So David pushed a little further. David, the great man of mercy. David, the man after God's own heart. David, the role model for the kings of Israel for all of time. David, our childhood hero. David decides to commit murder. David arranges for it, for the honorable man Uriah to be sent back to the field, not just to the field, to the front lines of the battle, to go out and then to have his less honorable general recall the troops behind him and leave Uriah on the field to die. And he does. So many questions about how a man of such quality of character as David ends up as a murderer before the story's over. The text ends with a story of grief, not on David's part. He's content that this episode is ended. But for Bathsheba, the object of David's desires, she has lost her husband, and through no fault of her own, has entered a very difficult time in her own life. Little time passes, and the prophet Nathan calls to David and says, "I'd like to tell you a story." By the way, a good word of wisdom here. Anytime a prophet says, "I'd like to tell you a story," you're in trouble. Jesus does this quite often. Nathan says, "Imagine a wealthy man and a poor man. Wealthy man has a field full of cattle. Poor man has one little ewe lamb that he loves as a pet, that he loves as a daughter. And the rich man has a guest come into his home. And following the rules of hospitality, he's supposed to offer up a feast, but he doesn't want to bother with his own. He has plenty. But he takes the ewe lamb of the man who had but one." Nathan says, "David, what? You're a good king. What do we do to a man like that?" David says, "Punish him, execute him, judgment, death, fourfold restitution for the sin that he's committed." At which point Nathan utters the Bible's most haunting words, "Thou art the man." You're the one. You're the guy. You did it. David, for his credit, will say, acknowledges that this sin was his. He doesn't try to justify it. He doesn't try to make it right. And still, there has to be consequences. And so if you read chapter 12, 7 through 14, the text explains that David, for his own part, receives what we might call a partial pardon. We'll come back to that later. David is told by the prophet, "You're right, you should die, but you won't. However, there will be a consequence, because there's always a consequence for sin. And in your case, it'll be a sword that will never leave your home. You will be haunted by this choice for the rest of your life." So ends the tale of David and Bathsheba. What do we notice about this story, and what are we supposed to take away from it? Why does the Bible take 2 chapters to tell us a story, and more, by the way? Two chapters at least to tell us the story of one of our heroes and to pull him down a peg. We really liked David. I didn't want to hear that. Why do we need to hear it? A couple of observations that I think will help you with this. Number one, as I mentioned earlier, this is not a love story. This is not a story about romance gone awry. This is a story about something very different. Listen to the words. Now I'll put them on the screen instead of summarizing them. Chapter 11, verse 4. So David sent messengers and took her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. Then she returned to her house. Boy, that's Hallmark material, isn't it? Do you see any romance anywhere in that? Any wooing, any courtship? Folks, this has nothing to do with love. This doesn't even have anything to do with romance. I'm not even entirely sure adultery is the right word, although it probably applies. The verbs in the sentence are power words. I sent a messenger, not a card, not a message, not a singing telegram. I sent messengers, the king did, and he took her. I was curious, so I went to the Hebrew text and said, what does take mean? Know what it means? Take. It's just a boring, bland Hebrew word that means like you would take something up in your hands, like you would take and acquire. Something you do to an object, not to a person. This is very different, by the way. There are other women who are wives of David, and quite often they're looked upon favorably. If you look at the other wives of David, the text will say, and God gave him so-and-so as his wife. Not here. Nothing given, only taken. And there's a difference. This is not love. Bathsheba is an object. Going a step further, to use just really obvious language, Bathsheba is essentially raped. Okay? This is not a romance. She is not courted. When a king says to a woman, you will come to me and I will take you, there's no indication in the text that she even consented. He sent a message, he took her, he lay with her. There's nothing about it that is romantic. When a person of greater power demands the body of another, we have an English word for that, and it's not romance. Bathsheba gets nothing out of this. She suffers. She suffers for David's sin. She suffers the loss of her husband, Uriah. She suffers the death of her child by David. Life doesn't go particularly well for Bathsheba, and she didn't ask for it. This isn't a love story. This is a tragedy. Furthermore, though, this is not a short story. And I want to emphasize this because I think when we tell this story, we really miss this part of it. When we talk about sin as Christians, what we tend to think about is an infraction of a law. And that's not a bad way of thinking about sin, okay? That's a good start. That's just not how we should stop. Sin is more than merely a transactional thing, where God says, don't jaywalk, and I jaywalk. Yes, I need to be forgiven for that. God says, don't do this, and I do it. Well, I'll quit doing that. Sin, in this sense, is more like a disease. Once you get it in your life, the consequences of it are lasting. The cure is painful. The story is long. In my recent life, I've been doing some reflecting. Sin is, oddly enough, a lot like cancer. That there's no part of it, including the cure, that isn't awful. And it sticks around and lingers longer than you would ever desire. Such is the story of sin in the life of David. It's not a short story. The direct story of David and Bathsheba ends in chapter 11, but the consequences roll on. And there's a phrase, in fact, in chapter 12 that I would encourage you to notice, because I think it plays into, I believe, here's my point I'm going to try to convince you of in the next few slides, the story of David and Bathsheba is the rest of David's story. Everything else that follows is connected to this event. Here's the line. Nathan says, as the Lord lives, the man who is, this is David's comment to Nathan over the parable. What should happen to the man who took the ewe lamb? As the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die, and he shall restore the lamb fourfold. By the way, for what it's worth, David is essentially quoting from Deuteronomy, which said exactly that. You steal something from a person, especially a poor person, pay it back fourfold. He's exactly right. Because he did this thing and because he had no pity. David had no pity either. Fourfold. Nathan then tells him, yeah, that's what's going to happen. You won't die, but your verdict will come to pass. Now, therefore, the sword shall never depart from your house. Thus says the Lord, behold, I will raise up evil against you out of your own house. There are going to be consequences. And David, the penalty you will pay is that you have to see the consequences of your choice in the lives of the people you love dearest. David, quite literally, suffers through a fourfold payment of his sin in the lives of his children. The first is in that same chapter. In chapter 12, the child that began the story, the child by Bathsheba, passes. But when David saw that his servants were whispering together, David understood that the child was dead. And David said to his servants, is the child dead? They said, he is dead. Number one, a fourfold. In the next couple of chapters, you skip ahead to chapter 13, it tells the story of some of David's other children. Tamar went to her brother. Tamar's a daughter. Tamar went to her brother Amnon's house where he was lying down, but he would not listen to her, and being stronger than she, he violated her and lay with her. One of his sons rapes one of his daughters. Number two. At the end of that story, Absalom, who loved his sister, takes Amnon and kills him. Amnon alone is dead, the verse says, for by the command of Absalom this has been determined from the days he violated his sister Tamar. One son of David murders another son of David. That's number three. And then Absalom himself leads a rebellion against David in the days ahead in chapter 18. And one of those notable warriors of David, Joab, finds him. He says, I will not waste time like this with you. And he took javelins in his hand, 3 of them, and thrust them into the heart of Absalom while he was still alive in the oak. And 10 young men, Joab's armor bearers, surrounded Absalom and struck him and killed him. That's number 4. The sons and daughters of David have violence and death throughout the remaining years of David, and David gets to sit back and watch. David gets to know that it's his fault. So how is that David's fault? He didn't do it. Didn't he, though? What moral high ground does David have for raising his children? Amnon rapes his sister. David, what do you say? You're not supposed to rape a woman, not supposed to overpower her and take her. Yeah, just like you did. Absalom kills his brother because he finds it more convenient than dealing with him. Absalom, you're not supposed to go killing people, don't you know that? Yeah, just like you did. Absalom decides he makes a bigger king than David, and so he takes what he wants. Absalom, that's not how you get what you want. Yeah, just like you did. David's own sins come to haunt him in the lives of his children. His moral authority has been utterly subverted, and he watches his crimes repeat themselves in the lives of those that he loves. This is not a happy story. The most tragic scene in this to me, that it gives me the chills every time I read it, comes from that last story and the death of Absalom. If you haven't taken some time to read the story of the death of Absalom, you really ought to. Absalom wages civil war against David. David is on the run, actually. Absalom is a strong, good-looking young man, a little bit more like Saul than he is like David. And he's winning the battle until finally a battle comes about and Absalom's forces lose. When they lose, David has only one question. He doesn't ask about how the kingdom fares. He doesn't ask, have I won? He doesn't ask, when can I get my capital back? When you read the story, he has one question, because he can count to 4 too. Back in the story of Nathan had said, or David rather, have said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. And Nathan said to David, the Lord also has put away your sin. You shall not die. But David has seen the death of too many children. So in the battle against Absalom in chapter 18 and verse 28, and Ahimaaz cried out to the king, all is well. And he bowed before the king with his face to the earth and said, "Blessed be the Lord your God, who has delivered up the men who raised their hand against my lord the king." This guy, by the way, thinks he's doing a great thing. He gets the good job. He gets to come tell the king, "We won." What does David want to know? And the king said, "Is it well with the young man Absalom? Is my son still alive? Is my son the rebel who is trying to kill me? Is he still alive?" Ahimaaz answered, "When Joab sent the king's servant, your servant, I saw a great commotion, but I do not know what it was." He kind of taken aback. He thought he was getting to deliver the news of the century. You won. You get to be king. We won the battle. And all the king wants to know is, "Yeah, but is my son alive?" He's kind of put off. It's not the response I was looking for. And then 2 verses later, another messenger comes. Behold, the Cushite came, and the Cushite said, "Good news for the Lord, the king, for the Lord has delivered you this day from the hand of all who rose up against you." Good news. Don't you like to be the guy with good news? David has one question. The king said to the Cushite, "Is it well with the young man Absalom?" The Cushite answered, "May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise against you for evil be like that young man." Well, that was smooth, by the way. What's the polite way to tell someone their king or their son is dead, right? "May all your enemies die the way Absalom died." And is David happy? Is David thrilled that his son has perished? Here it is. Here's the scene. "And the king was deeply moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, he said, 'Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son.'" I give you my 2 cents, and you don't have to believe me. I don't think he was talking about that day's battle. I think David is remembering the day when he sinned and the prophet said, "You should die today, but you won't." I think David is saying, "I wish I had died that day instead of you this day. Would that I had died instead of you." The moral of the story, if there is to be one, is this. This is an old quotation. I don't know what preacher first said it, but we've all stole it since. Sin will take you farther than you want to go, keep you longer than you want to stay, and cost you more than you want to pay. Sin is not jaywalking. Sin is not an infraction against an arbitrary rule. Sin is not a debit in your account or a credit on somebody else's. Sin is a disease, and it kills us. We don't merely need to be forgiven. We need to be remade because it is destroying us. And the consequences roll on and on and on and on. That's the story of sin. And the only reason we have any good news to say this morning is because another son of David died for David's sins and yours. People sometimes ask me, why does Jesus need to die on the cross? Why does it have to be that way? And if you think of sin as an infraction against arbitrary rules about some minor debt you owe God, well then why doesn't God just kind of snap his fingers and undo it? Wouldn't that be enough? If I've made God mad, why doesn't he get over it? If I just need to be forgiven, can't God do that? But if sin is a cosmic evil, if it is a disease that has infested our culture, our society, our families, our churches, and every element of our lives, we need a response just as large. We need someone who can take the brunt of that evil instead of us. And he did. There was one more son of David who had to die, and his name is Jesus of Nazareth. And he died for David's sins, and he died for yours. Because your story could be here instead. I don't know what you did, but you do. And I know what I did. And as much as I like to tell myself that mine are the minor infractions, it's just not the way it works, is it? The damage is done to me and to others. I remember the first time my little boy, my firstborn son, looked me in the eye and told me a lie. Just looked me in the eye, deadpan, and said something false. And at first, I was outraged. And then I remember that he must have learned to lie from the same people who taught him how to talk. My choices and my actions live on and have consequences that I can't measure. And I need a goodness that can't be measured to overcome it. Folks, that is the good news. The messengers of David kept trying to give him good news, but in reality, they didn't have any to give. It's only in the death of Jesus Christ and his resurrection that the good news ever arises. The wrongs can be made right in your lives, in every life, in all lives, in the power and the function and the work of Jesus Christ and his sacrifice. I don't often or always give an invitation at the end of my sermon, but it occurs to me, if ever there was a sermon that needed one, maybe this one's it. If you are a person who looks in your life and sees the sad and tragic, the long and winding consequences of sin and would like to be done with it, respond to the good news of Jesus Christ. We'll be here to help you. We're going to stand and sing. If you need to come, won't you, at this time?